All right, let's dive right in. Today we're going to talk about a medieval empire built by Viking princes and Slavic tribesmen, and whose legacy, well, it's still being debated and fought over all across Eastern Europe. We're talking about the story of the Kyivan Rus.
And at the very heart of it all was Kyiv. You have to imagine a city of just unimaginable wealth and power. For centuries, this was the magnificent capital of a huge, prosperous realm. Think of it like a bustling hub of trade and culture, so grand that people said it rivaled even Constantinople. And its nickname? Well, it was fittingly called the Mother of Rus cities.
And then, it was all gone. In the winter of 1240, the city, and really the entire empire it stood for, was just brutally annihilated by Mongol invaders. It was a catastrophe so total, it's honestly hard to wrap your head around.
So, that brings us to the big question, right? How could an empire that dominated this whole region for 300 years just vanish? I mean, so completely. To find the answer, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning.
Okay, so before the Kyivan Rus was a thing, the lands of modern-day Ukraine and Russia were, well, a pretty chaotic place. It was basically just a patchwork of warring Eastern Slavic tribes. But then, everything changed. New arrivals showed up from the north, sailing in these incredible dragon-headed longboats. These were Scandinavian warriors, and the Slavs had a name for them, the Rus.
Now, according to this amazing medieval text, the Primary Chronicle, the story goes like this. The Slavs actually managed to drive the Norsemen out at first, but what happened? They immediately fell back into fighting each other. So they send this message overseas, basically saying, hey, our land is great and rich, but there's no order. Please come rule over us. And they invited this Viking prince, Rurik, to do just that. And in 862, he did, establishing the Rurikid dynasty that would end up ruling for centuries.
So Rurik sets up his first capital up in the north, in a city called Novgorod. But his kinsman Oleg, well, Oleg was a lot more ambitious. In 882, he sails south, grabs this key trading outpost on the Dnieper River, and instantly gets just how important it is. He declares Kyiv the new capital, and bam, he unites the northern and southern trade routes and officially founds the Kyivan Rus.
Okay, so you've got a new state. How does it actually forge an identity? Well, for the Rus, the next 100 years or so were all about three pivotal figures. Their actions, driven by, revenge, conquest, and a search for faith, would literally define the soul of this new empire.
And it all starts with Princess Olga. Now, after her husband, Prince Igor, was brutally murdered by this tribe called the Drevlians, they made a huge mistake. They sent envoys to Olga suggesting she marry their prince. Olga pretended to agree, and in doing so, she set the stage for what is honestly one of the most epic acts of vengeance in all of history.
I mean, what's so incredible here is the sheer creativity of her revenge. It's wild. First, she has the envoys buried alive in their own boat. Next, she tricks their best soldiers into a bathhouse and burns them alive. Then she holds a funeral feast for her husband, gets 5,000 Drevlians drunk, and has her men massacre them. And the grand finale? She burns their capital to the ground, get this, using birds with burning sulfur tied to their legs. The lesson here? You do not mess with Olga.
So, Olga's brutal but effective consolidation of power paved the way for her to eventually convert to Orthodox Christianity, which was a really savvy political move. Her son, Sviatoslav, though, he wanted absolutely nothing to do with it. He was a pure pagan warrior through and through. They even compared him to a snow leopard for his speed and ferocity. The guy lived for constant conquest, and yeah, he dramatically expanded the Rus' territory, but he completely scorned his mother's new faith.
So it falls to Sviatoslav's son, Vladimir the Great, to figure this out. He understood that a unifying religion was absolutely essential, and the legend is just fantastic. He sends out envoys to check out the world's great faiths. He dismisses Judaism, arguing that its followers had lost their homeland. He rejects Islam, famously saying drinking is the joy of the Rus, so that's a no-go. And he looked at the Catholic churches in the West and just found them without beauty.
But then, his envoys went to Constantinople. The sheer splendor of the Hagia Sophia, the whole Orthodox ritual, it just completely blew them away. They came back and told Vladimir we no longer knew if we were in heaven or on earth. And for Vladimir, that was it. The decision was made. The Rus were going to become an Orthodox Christian empire.
And wow, what a choice it was! This decision ushered in an absolute golden age under Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise. Seriously, during his reign, the Kyivan Rus reached the absolute peak of its power, its prestige, and its cultural achievement.
Yaroslav was a true state builder. I mean, look at the checklist. He created the very first Rus law code. He built schools, promoted literacy, he commissioned Kyiv's absolutely spectacular St. Sophia's Cathedral, and on the world stage, he married his daughters into the royal families of France, Hungary, and Norway, making Kyiv a huge player in European politics. Oh, and he also decisively crushed the Pechenegs, this nomadic threat that had been a thorn in their side for decades.
But, and this is a huge but, his final act would end up dooming the whole realm. He divided the empire among his sons. Now, this was pretty common for rulers back then, but for the Rus, it was uniquely fatal. He was trying to prevent a war of succession, a good intention, but instead he planted the seeds of civil war and disunity that would eventually tear the whole thing apart.
And this right here is the crucial point. By the time this new, terrifying threat emerges from the east, the Kyivan Rus isn't a united empire anymore. Not even close. It's just a collection of feuding principalities, completely exposed and honestly ripe for destruction.
So, the first time they meet the Mongols, it's an absolute disaster. At the Battle of the Kalka River, the Rus princes can't even agree on a single commander or a basic strategy. They fall for a classic Mongol trick, the feigned retreat, and get completely annihilated by the unified, disciplined army led by the legendary General Subutai. It was just a brutal, brutal warning of what was coming.
And you'd think they learn, right? But no. The Rus princes learned absolutely nothing. When the full Mongol invasion under Batu Khan kicks off, they still refuse to unite. They literally just watch as their neighbors' cities are burned to the ground and their people are slaughtered, each one foolishly thinking, oh, the storm will pass me by. Just incredible.
And then finally, in 1240, the Mongol horde arrives at the gates of Kyiv itself. Now, to put this in perspective, Kyiv's population at the time was around 50,000 people. That made this grand capital one of the largest, most vibrant cities in all of Europe.
And after the Mongols breached the walls and finished their brutal work, only about 2,000 people were left alive, from 50,000 down to 2,000. The mother of Rus cities was nothing more than a smoldering ruin. Just like that, the era of the Kyivan Rus was over.
But wait, the story doesn't quite end there. Way up in the far north, the great city republic of Novgorod actually survived the apocalypse. And the reason it survived? Because its prince made an incredibly difficult, but also incredibly pragmatic choice.
That prince was Alexander Nevsky, and you have to appreciate the situation he was in. It was completely impossible. He was facing two existential threats at the exact same time. You've got the Teutonic Knights and Swedish Crusaders coming from the west, and the unstoppable Mongol horde from the east. He couldn't fight both. He had to choose.
And this really breaks down his logic. Look at the Western Crusaders. Their goal was to forcefully convert his people to Catholicism. That would mean eradicating their Orthodox faith, their whole culture. Now, look at the Mongols. They were actually pretty religiously tolerant. They really didn't care who you worshipped as long as you paid your tribute and stayed loyal. So for Nevsky, the choice was actually pretty clear. He had to fight the enemy that threatened his people's very soul.
And this decision, it makes him one of the most complex, most controversial figures in history. On the one hand, he's venerated as a saint for saving the Orthodox faith from the Crusaders. But he did it by becoming a loyal vassal of the Mongol Khans. He even helped enforce their brutal rule over his own people. So what do you think he was? A savior who preserved his culture, or a collaborator who bowed to an empire? It's a tough question, and its consequences are still echoing across Eastern Europe today.